David never believed in anything he couldn't see or touch. At 28, he worked as a graphic designer from his small apartment in Portland. He was the kind of person who laughed at ghost stories and rolled his eyes when people talked about aliens. Life was simple, logical, and predictable. That's exactly how he liked it, but lately, something had been different. For the past 3 weeks, David had been having the strangest dreams. They weren't normal dreams about work or childhood memories. Instead, he saw places that looked nothing like Earth, crystal towers that seemed to grow from the ground like trees, skies that shifted between purple and gold. And always. There was this feeling like someone was trying to tell him something important. David tried to ignore these dreams. He told himself it was just stress from work. Maybe he was watching too many science fiction movies. But the dreams kept getting stronger, more real. Sometimes he would wake up feeling like he had actually been to these impossible places. On this particular Tuesday night in late September, David was working late on a project for a client. The deadline was tomorrow, and he still had hours of work ahead of him. His computer screen glowed in the dark room as he carefully adjusted colors and text. Outside, Portland was quiet except for the occasional car passing by. Around midnight, David noticed something strange. His bedroom felt unusually cold. Checked the heater twice, but it was working perfectly. The temperature gauge showed 72 degrees, but the air felt like it was barely 60. He put on a sweater and went back to work, thinking maybe he was just tired. But then his phone started acting weird. The screen would flicker for no reason. His laptop kept freezing even though he had just bought it 6 months ago. The Wi-Fi kept disconnecting and reconnecting. David tried restarting. Everything but nothing helped. It was like some invisible force was messing with all his electronics. By 2 in the morning, David was getting frustrated. Nothing was working right. He decided to take a break and maybe get some sleep. But as he was saving his work, he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound like nothing he had ever heard before. Not quite a hum, not quite a whistle. It reminded him of the noise a wine glass makes when you run your finger around the rim, but much deeper and more musical. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. David looked around his room, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. That's when he noticed something impossible. The air near his window was shimmering, like heat waves rising from hot pavement in summer. It was September, and his room was cold. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he was seeing things from staring at the computer screen too long. But when he looked again, the shimmering was still there. It was getting stronger. David stood up slowly, his heart starting to beat faster. The logical part of his mind was trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was a reflection from a car. Outside, maybe the neighbor was using some kind of new heating system. Maybe he was just hallucinating from lack of sleep, but then something happened that made all his logical explanations crumble. A figure started to appear in the shimmering air. Not like a ghost materializing or someone walking through a door. It was more like watching someone step through water, gradually becoming clearer and more solid. David wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there watching. But his body wouldn't move. The figure was clearly female, but unlike any woman David had ever seen. She was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with long, graceful limbs that seemed to move in slow motion. Her skin had an unusual quality to it, like it was glowing very softly from within. Not bright enough to light up the room, but enough to make her clearly visible in the darkness. But it was her eyes that really caught David's attention. They were larger than human eyes, taking up more of her face than seemed possible. And they weren't just one color. They seemed to shift between deep blue and bright silver, like looking at the surface of a calm lake under changing light. David's mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. His first thought was that he was dreaming. But he could feel the cold air on his skin, could hear the sound of his own breathing, could smell the coffee he had made earlier. Everything felt completely real. The being looked directly at him, and David felt something he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, though he probably should have been terrified. It was more like recognition, as if he was seeing someone he had met before, but couldn't quite remember when or where. But then something else hit him. A scent, It wasn't perfume or any kind of fragrance David had ever encountered. It was completely alien, but somehow not unpleasant. It reminded him of the air right before a thunderstorm, mixed with something floral, but not any flower he could name. The scent was subtle at first, but it seemed to fill his entire awareness. As the scent grew stronger, David felt his mind beginning to change. It's not in a scary way, but like someone was gently adjusting the focus on a camera. The colors in his room seemed more vivid. Sounds became clearer. Even his own thoughts felt sharper and more organized. The being took a step closer, and David realized she was trying to communicate with him. Not with words, but with something deeper. Images started forming in his mind. Not his own thoughts, but ideas and feelings that were definitely coming from her. He sensed her name, though it wasn't really a name in the way humans used names. It was more like a feeling of identity, a sense of who she was. If he had to translate it into human language, it would be something like Zara. But that was just the closest his mind could come to understanding it. Who she was and what she wanted, but no words came out. Instead, he found himself thinking his questions, and somehow knowing that she could hear his thoughts as clearly as if he had spoken them out loud. The strange thing was, David wasn't panicking. Any reasonable person would have been screaming or running or calling the police. But something about Zara's presence, and especially her scent, made him feel calm and alert at the same time. It was like his brain was working better than it ever had before. As the minutes passed, David began to understand that this wasn't a random encounter. Zara had come here specifically to find him, and somehow some part of him had been expecting her, even though he had never consciously believed in anything like this. The scent continued to affect him in ways he couldn't fully understand. It was changing him, waking up parts of his mind that had been asleep his entire life. David realized that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. He stood there in his small apartment, face to face with someone from another world, breathing in a scent that was rewriting the basic rules of everything he thought he knew about reality. And despite how impossible it all was, David felt like he was finally truly awake for the first time in his life. David stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Zara hadn't moved closer, but somehow he could feel her presence filling the entire room. It was like standing next to a warm fireplace on a cold day, except the warmth wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something that touched his mind and soul. Then, without warning, images started flooding into his consciousness. It's not like watching a movie or remembering a dream, but like experiencing someone else's memories firsthand. David saw vast landscapes under alien skies, with 3 moons hanging in a purple twilight. He witnessed cities that seemed to be grown rather than built, with structures that curved and twisted like living things. The images came faster now. David saw Zara's people moving through these incredible places. They were tall and graceful, just like her, but each one was slightly different. Some had skin that shimmered like water. Others seemed to glow with soft internal light. What struck David most was how peaceful they all seemed. There was no rushing, no stress, no anger. They moved with purpose, but without the frantic energy that humans always carried. Through these shared visions, David began to understand more about Zara herself. She wasn't just a random visitor to Earth. She was part of something much bigger, something that had been planned for a very long time. Her people had been watching Earth for decades, studying humans from a distance, trying to understand how their minds worked. But why Earth? Why humans? The answer came to David not in words, but in feelings and concepts that his mind slowly translated into understanding. Zara's planet was dying. It's not from war or destruction, but from natural causes. Their sun was becoming unstable, growing hotter and more dangerous each year. Soon, it would be impossible for her people to survive there. Some of her kind were looking for new worlds to live on. Others, like Zara, were studying different forms of life to see if they could learn new ways of thinking and existing. Humans fascinated them because human consciousness was so different from their own, where Zara's people thought in harmony. In shared experiences, humans were individuals. each with their own private thoughts and emotions. David felt a wave of sadness from Zara as she shared these images. Her people weren't invaders or conquerors. They were refugees, scientists, and explorers, all rolled into one. They needed help, but they also had so much to offer in return. But there was something else, something more personal, as Zara continued. To communicate through images and feelings, David realized that this wasn't their first meeting. It's not exactly, anyway. More memories began to surface in David's mind, but these weren't Zara's memories. They were his own, buried so deep that he had forgotten they ever existed. He was 5 years old again, lying in his childhood bed, talking to what his parents called an imaginary friend. But the friend hadn't been imaginary at all. David remembered now the dreams, the strange conversations, the feeling of being watched over by someone who cared about him. It had all been real. Zara's people had contacted him as a child, recognizing something special in his young mind. They had been preparing him slowly and carefully. For this moment, his parents had been worried about his overactive imagination. They'd taken him to doctors, thinking something was wrong with him. The doctors had said it was normal for children to have imaginary friends, that he would grow out of it. And eventually, David did seem to grow out of it. The dreams stopped, the strange experiences faded, and he became a normal kid. But now David understood what had really happened. The contact had been interrupted. Something had gone wrong with the communication, and the connection had been severed. Zara's people had been forced to wait to let David grow up normally, hoping that someday they could re-establish the link. That's why he had been having those strange dreams again recently. Zara had been trying to reconnect with him, slowly bringing his buried memories back to the surface. The scent that filled his room wasn't just communication. It was a key, unlocking parts of his mind that had been sealed away for over 20 years. David looked at Zara with new understanding. She wasn't just a visitor from another world. It was an old friend, someone who had been part of his life since childhood, even though he had forgotten her existence. But why him? What made David special compared to billions of other humans? The answer came through another wave of shared thoughts and feelings. It wasn't that David was better than other people. He was just different. His brain worked in a way that made it possible for him to communicate with Zara's people. It was like having a rare blood type, except instead of blood, it was the structure of his consciousness that was unusual. There were others like him scattered around the world. Not many, but enough to serve as bridges between the two species. David was one of perhaps 100 humans who had this natural ability to connect with alien minds. And right now, his planet needed those bridges more than ever. Climate change was accelerating on Earth. Political tensions were rising. Humans were facing challenges that they might not be able to solve alone. But Zara's people had technologies and knowledge that could help. They had learned to live in harmony with their environment, to solve problems through cooperation rather than conflict. The catch was that most humans weren't ready for open contact with an alien species. The shock would cause panic, maybe even war. So Zara's people had developed a different plan. It would work through individuals like David, people who could handle the truth and help prepare humanity for what was coming. David felt the weight of this responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was being asked to become a secret ambassador to an alien civilization. His normal life of designing graphics and watching Netflix would have to become a cover story for something much more important. But as he looked into Zara's shifting eyes, breathing in that strange, wonderful scent that seemed to make everything clearer, David realized he had already made his choice. He had been making it his whole life, even when he didn't remember why. The scent grew stronger, carrying with it new information, new understanding. David could feel his mind expanding, becoming capable of things he had never imagined. And for the first time since childhood, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Zara stepped closer, and David knew that his real life was just beginning. David felt something changing inside his mind as Zara moved closer. It was like someone had been slowly turning up the volume on a radio, and suddenly he could hear stations he never knew existed. The world around him seemed sharper, more alive. Colors were brighter. The sound of his own heartbeat was crystal clear. Even the texture of the air against his skin felt different. but the most amazing change was in his memory. Things he had forgotten were coming back with perfect clarity. Not just the childhood encounters with Zara's people, but everything. He remembered being 7 years old and drawing pictures that his art teacher couldn't understand, in shapes that seemed to flow from his pencil without any conscious thought. His parents had kept some of those drawings, thinking they were just creative scribbles. Now David realized those drawings had been messages. His young mind had been trying to communicate with Zara's people using symbols and concepts that didn't exist in human language. The connection had been stronger then, for the interference that cut off their communication. David also remembered why he had always been different from other kids. While his friends were playing normal games, he would spend hours staring at the sky, feeling like he was waiting for something important. He had a strange ability to sense what other people were feeling, even when they tried to hide it. His parents thought he was just very sensitive, but now David understood it was something more. The scent that filled his room was doing more than just bringing back memories. It was activating parts of his brain that had been sleeping for decades. David could feel new pathways forming in his mind, new ways of thinking and perceiving the world. It was exciting and terrifying at the same time. Through their mental connection, Zara showed David what would happen if he chose to help her people. He saw himself meeting others like him, humans who had been contacted as children and were now being awakened to their true purpose. Together, they would form a secret network, preparing Earth for the changes that were coming. But Zara also showed him what would happen if he refused. She would erase his memories of this encounter, just like what had happened when he was a child. David would go back to his normal life, never knowing that he had been chosen for something greater. The strange dreams would stop, the enhanced abilities would fade, and he would become just another ordinary person. The choice seemed obvious, but David found himself hesitating. Accepting meant giving up the simple life he had built for himself. It meant keeping huge secrets from his friends and family. It meant being responsible for helping two entirely different species understand each other. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he made mistakes that caused problems between humans and Zara's people? What if the government found out and decided he was a threat? David's mind filled with doubts and fears. Zara sensed his uncertainty and shared more images with him. She showed him possible futures where humans and her people worked together. Technologies that could clean up the environment without destroying the economy. Medical advances that could eliminate diseases and extend human life. Ways of thinking that could help humanity solve problems like poverty and conflict. But she also showed him darker possibilities. Climate change getting worse until parts of Earth became uninhabitable. Wars over resources as different countries competed for what was left. Humanity struggling alone with problems that could be solved easily with the right knowledge and cooperation. David realized that this wasn't just about him. His decision would affect the entire future of both species. If he and others like him failed to build bridges between humans and Zara's people, both civilizations might miss their chance to help each other. The scent seemed to pulse stronger as David wrestled with his decision. Each breath made him feel more connected to Zara and her people. He could sense their hopes and fears, their desperate need to find a new home, their genuine desire to help humanity grow and prosper. But there was something else in the scent now. Something that made David's heart race with excitement rather than fear. It was the promise of adventure, of discovery, of becoming part of something bigger than he had ever imagined. All his life, David had felt like he was waiting for something important to happen. Now he knew what he had been waiting for. David thought about his current life. His job designing graphics was fine, but it didn't feel meaningful. He had friends, but none of them really understood him. He had hobbies and interests, but nothing that made him feel truly alive. For years, he had been going through the motions, feeling like there was something missing but never knowing what it was. Now he knew. The missing piece was purpose, real purpose. Not just making money or keeping busy, but actually making a difference in the world. Maybe even in the universe. Zara waited patiently as David worked through his thoughts and feelings. She didn't try to pressure him or convince him. The choice had to be completely his own, made freely and without coercion. That was important to her people. It would only work with humans who genuinely wanted to help, not those who were forced or tricked into cooperation. David looked around his small apartment one last time. The computer screen still glowed with his unfinished project. His coffee mug sat on the desk, half empty and probably cold by now. Everything looked the same, but David knew that he would never see it the same way again. He had spent 28 years living a normal human life. Now he was being offered the chance to become something more, to use abilities he never knew he had, to help solve problems that seemed impossible, to be part of the most important development in human history. The scent wrapped around him like a warm blanket, carrying with it feelings of acceptance and belonging. For the first time in his adult life, David felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, with exactly the right person. At exactly the right moment, he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with that amazing alien scent, and made his choice. David looked into Zara's shifting eyes and nodded. He was ready to begin his real life. The moment David nodded his agreement, everything changed. As Zara stepped forward and gently placed her hands on either side of his head. Her touch was warm and electric, sending tingles through his entire body. The scent that had been surrounding him suddenly intensified, becoming so rich and complex that David felt like he was breathing in liquid starlight. What happened next was beyond anything David could have imagined. It was like someone had suddenly switched on lights in a house where he had been living in darkness his whole life. His vision exploded with new colors that didn't have names. He could see energy flowing through the walls of his apartment, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air itself seemed alive, filled with patterns and currents that he had never noticed before. But it wasn't just his eyesight that changed. David's hearing became incredibly sharp. He could hear his neighbor's cat purring 3 floors down. The electrical hum of every device in his building created a complex symphony in his ears. Even more amazing, he could hear something like voices in the electromagnetic fields around him, as if the very air was trying to communicate. The transformation wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. David felt like his brain was expanding, making room for new ways of thinking and perceiving reality. Information flowed through his mind faster than he could process it. He understood concepts that he had never learned, new things that no human should be able to know. Through their connection, Zara guided him through the changes. She showed him how to control his new abilities, how to focus them without becoming lost in the flood of new sensations. It was like learning to drive a car while the car was being built around you. Exciting but also terrifying, David discovered. That he could now sense other people's emotions from incredible distances. He felt the contentment of a night shift worker several blocks away. He sensed the anxiety of a student cramming for an exam in a nearby apartment building. Most surprisingly, he could detect other people like himself, humans with the same rare brain pattern that made communication with Zara's people possible. The scent that had started this whole transformation was now part of him permanently. It wasn't just something he smelled anymore. It was like a new sense organ that could detect things his old 5 senses never could. Through it, he could feel Zara's emotions, understand her thoughts, and even catch glimpses of her memories. But the most incredible discovery was that David could now communicate with Zara's people across vast distances. Even when she wasn't physically present, he could sense her presence somewhere out there among the stars. It was like having a phone line directly to another world, except instead of sound, it carried thoughts and feelings. Over the following days, David learned to live with his enhanced abilities. Going to work became an adventure. He could sense his coworkers' moods before they walked into the room. He could tell which clients were going to be difficult just by looking at their emails. His design work improved dramatically because he could somehow sense what colors and shapes would have the most emotional impact on viewers. But the changes weren't just professional. David found himself eating less, but feeling more energized. He needed less sleep, but felt more rested. His reflexes became lightning fast. He could catch a falling glass before his conscious mind even realized it was falling. The most challenging part was keeping everything secret. David's friends and family noticed that he seemed different, more confident and alert. When they asked about it, he had to make up stories about a new exercise routine or a change in diet. He hated lying to people he cared about, but he understood why secrecy was necessary. Zara had explained that humanity wasn't ready for the truth about alien contact. The governments of the world would panic. Religious leaders would be confused. and frightened. Regular people might react with fear or even violence. The only safe way to proceed was slowly. Through individuals like David who could handle the truth and help prepare others. David's first real assignment came 2 weeks after his transformation. Zara gave him the location of another person with the same rare brain pattern. This person lived in Seattle, about 3 hours away by car. David was nervous about making contact, but Zara assured him that he would know what to do when the time came. The person turned out to be a librarian named Alex, who had been having the same kind of strange dreams that David had experienced. When David walked into the library, he could immediately sense something different about Alex. The scent communication kicked in automatically, and David found himself able to share images and feelings just like Zara had done with him. Alex was frightened at first, but David's presence had a calming effect. The transformation process was easier with David there to guide it, to explain what was happening and help Alex understand the incredible opportunity they were being offered. Within a month, David had successfully contacted 3 other people with the same abilities. Each one was unique, with their own personality and background, but all shared the same potential for bridging the gap between human and alien consciousness. The network was growing. David could feel the connections spreading like roots underground, linking people across the country and around the world. Sometimes he would sense new contacts being made in other cities, other countries. The scent-based communication system was creating a global web of human ambassadors, all working toward the same goal. But with each new contact, David also felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. He was no longer just responsible for his own choices, he was helping to guide the future of human civilization. Every decision he made could affect millions of people who didn't even know this was happening. The scent that had once seemed so alien now felt like home. It was his connection to something greater than himself, his link to a universe full of possibilities that most humans couldn't even imagine. And as David lay in bed each night feeling the presence of his alien friend somewhere among the stars, he knew that he had made the right choice. His ordinary life was over. His extraordinary life had just begun. 6 months had passed since that incredible night when Zara first walked into David's room. Looking back, it felt like a lifetime ago. The man who had sat at his computer that Tuesday evening, worried about deadlines and wondering why his electronics weren't working, seemed like a stranger to him now. David's life had completely transformed, but in ways that most people would never notice. To his friends and family, he was still the same graphic designer living in Portland. He still went to work every day, still met friends for coffee, still complained about the weather. But underneath this normal surface, David was living a double life that was beyond most people's wildest imagination. The network of human contacts had grown far beyond. What started with just him and Alex had expanded to over 30 people across North America. Each new contact brought their own unique abilities and perspectives. There was Riley, a nurse in Chicago who could sense illness in people before symptoms appeared. There was Jordan, a teacher in Vancouver, who could somehow calm even the most difficult students. Just by being in the same room, all of them shared the same story. Strange dreams in childhood that their parents dismissed, unusual abilities that they learned to hide, feeling of waiting for something important without knowing what it was. And now, all of them were connected through the same scent-based communication system that had first brought David and Zara together. The scent had become such a natural part of David's existence that he sometimes forgot how strange it would seem to other people. It carried information constantly now, updates from Zara and her people, messages from other human contacts, and even warnings about potential problems. David had learned to interpret its subtle changes like reading a complex language that used smell instead of words. Through this network, David discovered that Zara's people had been much busier than he had realized. They had been working behind the scenes to help humanity in small but important ways. Natural disasters that should have been much worse were mysteriously less destructive. Scientists were having breakthrough moments that led to cleaner technologies. Political tensions that seemed ready to explode somehow found peaceful resolutions. None of it was obvious enough to attract attention, but the pattern was clear to David and the other contacts. Zara's people were gently guiding human civilization toward a more stable and peaceful future. They were preparing Earth for the day when open contact would be possible. But that day was still years away, maybe decades. David had learned that patience was one of the most important qualities for his new role. Change had to happen slowly, carefully, without causing panic or resistance. Rush things, and the whole plan could collapse. David's relationship with Zara had deepened in ways he never expected. She visited him regularly now, not just appearing in his room, but meeting him in quiet parks or empty buildings where they wouldn't be seen. Their communication had evolved beyond just sharing information. They talked about hopes and fears, about the differences between their species, about what the future might hold. What surprised David most was how much they had in common. Despite coming from completely different worlds, Zara had the same curiosity about life that David did. She loved learning new things, exploring new ideas, and trying to understand how things worked. She had a sense of humor that was different from human humor, but still made David laugh. Sometimes, David wondered if what he felt for Zara was love. It wasn't like any romantic relationship he had ever experienced with a human. But there was definitely a deep connection, an emotional bond that went beyond friendship, or even the shared mission that brought them together. The physical differences between them had become less important over time. Yes, Zara was taller than any human woman, and her skin had that unusual glow, and her eyes shifted colors in ways that should have been impossible. But David had gotten used to all of that. What mattered more was her intelligence, her kindness, and the way she made him feel like he was part of something important. David's work as a graphic designer had become a perfect cover for his real activities. He could travel to meet new contacts under the pretense of meeting clients. He could work flexible hours that allowed time for his ambassador duties. And his enhanced abilities had made him so much better at his job that clients were practically fighting to hire him. But the most rewarding part of David's new life was seeing other people go through the same transformation he had experienced. Every time he helped someone discover their hidden abilities, every time he watched their eyes light up as they realized they weren't alone, David felt a deep satisfaction that no regular job could ever provide. The challenges were real, though. Keeping such a huge secret from everyone he cared about was emotionally exhausting. There were times when David desperately wanted to tell his parents or his best friend about what was really happening in his life. But he understood why secrecy was necessary, and he had made a commitment to protect both species by keeping quiet. David had also learned that not everyone who was contacted chose to join the network. Some people were too frightened by the experience. Others couldn't handle the responsibility. Few simply preferred their normal lives to the uncertainty of becoming an alien ambassador. David respected their choices, even though it sometimes meant losing people he had hoped to work with. As David stood in his apartment one evening, looking out at the same window where Zara had first appeared, he marveled at how much his world had expanded. He could sense his network contacts across the continent, feel Zara's presence among the stars, and perceive layers of reality that most humans never knew existed. The scent that had started it all was still there, still carrying its complex messages and connections. But now it felt like breathing itself, as natural and necessary as his heartbeat. It was his link to a larger universe, his reminder that he was part of something bigger than himself. David smiled as he felt Zara's presence approaching. She would be arriving soon for their weekly meeting, bringing news from her people and updates on the progress being made toward eventual open contact. They would discuss new potential contacts, plan the next phase of the network's expansion, and perhaps just enjoy each other's company for a while. His ordinary life as a skeptical graphic designer was over forever. In its place was an extraordinary existence as a bridge between worlds, a guardian of humanity's future, and a friend. Two beings from among the stars. David wouldn't trade it for anything.